On the morning of August 25, 1941, British and Indian troops crossed Iran's western border from Iraq, while Soviet forces poured across the northern frontier from the Caucasus and Turkmenistan, launching an unprovoked invasion of a neutral country that had declared no hostility toward either power and whose greatest crime was refusing to expel German engineers working on railways and factories. The invasion, coordinated between the British Empire and Soviet Union just 2 months after Germany's attack on Russia, had transformed these longtime rivals into desperate allies, demonstrated how quickly diplomatic niceties vanished when great powers needed resources, with Iran's location astride crucial supply routes and atop vast oil reserves, making the country too strategically valuable to remain independent, regardless of its proclaimed neutrality. Within 3 days, Iranian resistance collapsed as hopelessly outmatched defenders faced over 80,000 Allied troops, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft, forcing Reza Shah to capitulate and accept foreign occupation that would transform Iran into what Winston Churchill later called the bridge to victory, while inflicting economic catastrophe and famine that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians who starved so that Allied supplies could flow north to the Soviet Union. Iran had enjoyed relative peace with the great powers surrounding it through the 1930s, ruled since 1925 by Reza Shah, who had focused on internal development and modernization while carefully maintaining neutrality between Britain and the Soviet Union, whose imperial ambitions had threatened Iranian independence for over a century. The Shah continued allowing the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to monopolize Iran's southern oil fields, providing Britain with petroleum resources crucial to its empire, while looking to other nations, especially Germany, to import technology, machinery, and industrial expertise needed to modernize his nation. In 1938, Iran completed the Trans-Iranian Railway, an engineering marvel that linked the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea for the first time, running 1,400 kilometers through mountain ranges and deserts that required hundreds of bridges and tunnels, boosting trade and internal mobility while demonstrating Iran's determination to develop without becoming dependent on British or Soviet assistance. The railway, built with American engineering firms and equipped with 65 German locomotives and technical expertise from hundreds of German engineers and technicians working across Iran's industries, represented exactly the kind of independent development that threatened British and Soviet control over the region. When Britain and Germany went to war in September 1939, Reza Shah declared Iran's neutrality, refusing British demands to expel German nationals who the British viewed as potential spies gathering intelligence on oil facilities and military positions. For 2 years, Britain grumbled about German presence in Iran, but took no action beyond diplomatic protests, as the war in Europe and North Africa kept British forces far too busy to worry about Iran, as long as oil continued flowing from Anglo-Iranian facilities in the south. Everything changed on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending 3 million troops crashing across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history, transforming the strategic situation overnight, as Britain suddenly found itself with a powerful but desperately threatened ally. The initial weeks of Barbarossa brought disaster for the Soviet Union as seemingly unstoppable German panzer divisions drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies while capturing millions of prisoners, raising the terrifying prospect that the Soviet Union might collapse before the end of 1941 and leave Britain alone, again facing a German Reich that controlled resources from the Atlantic to the Urals. British leaders recognized that Soviet survival was now essential to British survival, as a German victory in the east would free millions of Wehrmacht troops to turn west against Britain and North Africa, while providing Germany access to Soviet oil, grain, and industrial resources that would make the Nazi regime invincible. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite his lifelong hatred of communism, immediately pledged British support for the Soviet Union, promising to send whatever military supplies Britain could spare to help the Red Army resist German advances. By August 1941, British convoys were running through Arctic waters to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, braving German submarines, aircraft, and surface ships to deliver tanks, aircraft, and ammunition that the Soviets desperately needed. But the Arctic route had severe limitations, as ice closed northern ports for months each year, while German air and naval forces based in Norway made the convoys extremely dangerous, with some losing significant percentages of their ships to German attacks. British planners recognized that far greater quantities of equipment would be needed if the Soviets were to survive, requiring a safer supply route with greater capacity that could operate year-round without running the gauntlet of German forces. When British eyes turned south looking for alternatives, Iran's newly completed Trans-Iranian Railway appeared like a gift from heaven, offering a direct route from Persian Gulf ports controlled by Britain to the Soviet border that could handle massive cargo shipments if only the British and Soviets controlled it. Alongside the railway's strategic value, British planners had to consider the nightmare scenario where German forces broke through Soviet defenses in the Caucasus and drove south into Iran, seizing the Anglo-Iranian oil fields that provided Britain with petroleum resources essential to its war economy, while potentially linking up with German forces in North Africa to surround and destroy British positions in Egypt and the Middle East. Iran's declared neutrality and the presence of hundreds of German engineers and technicians throughout the country created fears in London that Iran might welcome German forces or even join the Axis. Once Wehrmacht panzers appeared on Iran's northern border, making a German conquest of the Middle East a realistic possibility unless Britain acted first. On July 19, 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union sent a diplomatic note to Reza Shah demanding the immediate expulsion of all German nationals from Iran, presenting the demand as a reasonable security measure that a truly neutral country would accept without hesitation. The Shah found himself trapped between impossible choices, with Germany urging him to resist Allied pressure and maintain genuine neutrality, while the Allies made clear they expected him to side definitively with them by purging German influence from his country. Reza Shah's response attempted to split the difference, promising to deport any German citizens where clear evidence existed of espionage or hostile acts, but refusing wholesale expulsion of engineers and technicians whose skills Iran needed for industrial development. The Shah may have miscalculated, not realizing how desperate the Allied position had become or how much importance Britain and the Soviet Union now placed on controlling Iran's territory and resources. The Allies, unsatisfied by this non-committal reply and convinced they had no time for lengthy negotiations while German armies drove deeper into Soviet territory every day, swiftly decided that Iran would join the Allied cause, whether Reza Shah agreed or not. On July 22nd, Lieutenant General Edward Quinan, commander of Allied forces in Iraq, received orders to prepare an invasion plan, beginning military preparations, while diplomats made one final attempt to bring Iran into line peacefully. On August 16, 1941, the Allies presented Iran with another diplomatic note that was essentially a thinly veiled ultimatum, demanding that Iran expel German nationals and turn over control of the Trans-Iranian Railway and other transport infrastructure to Allied control or face military consequences. When Reza Shah refused, still believing the Allies were bluffing and would not actually invade a neutral country, he sealed his country's fate, as Allied commanders had already assembled forces on Iran's borders and needed only final authorization to attack. General Queen Anne's forces totaled approximately 30,000 troops, mostly from the Indian Army, organized into the 8th and 10th Indian Infantry Divisions, with the 10th Division under Major General William Slim possessing the only tanks available in the form of the 9th Armored Brigade. The plan called for the 8th Division to strike into southern Iran, seizing the critical oil facilities at Abadan as quickly as possible, while Slim's 10th Division, with its armor and motorized infantry, would drive into Iran's interior toward the cities of Kermanshah and Hamadan. Soviet forces were even larger, with General Dmitry Kozlov's Trans-Caucasian Front deploying 3 armies totaling approximately 50,000 troops on Iran's northern borders, supported by over 400 aircraft that would face barely a dozen aging Iranian biplanes. The disparity in military power was overwhelming, as Allied forces brought more than 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft against an Iranian army that numbered 120,000 men on paper but was hopelessly undersupplied, spread across vast distances, equipped with outdated weapons, and had no experience fighting modern mechanized warfare. Iranian forces lacked the tanks, aircraft, anti-tank weapons, and communications equipment necessary to coordinate effective resistance against enemies attacking simultaneously from multiple directions with overwhelming superiority in firepower and mobility. At dawn on August 25, 1941, Allied forces crossed Iran's borders as British and Indian troops advanced from Iraq, while Soviet armies poured across the northern frontier at 3 separate points. In the northwest, Soviet tanks and infantry, supported by massive air superiority, smashed through Iranian defensive positions, advancing so rapidly that the Iranian 3rd and 4th Divisions found themselves outflanked and surrounded before they could organize coherent resistance. By August 26th, Soviet forces captured the city of Tabriz after overwhelming Iranian defenders, who fought bravely but simply lacked the weapons and numbers to stop Soviet armor, while other Soviet columns drove along the Caspian coast, cutting Iranian forces off from any retreat toward the Turkish border. In southern Iran, British and Indian troops struck toward the oil facilities at Abadan, encountering fierce resistance from the Iranian 6th Division, whose soldiers fought with what British reports later described as the highest bravery and tenacious gallantry, despite knowing their position was hopeless. The battle for Abadan lasted through August 25th, with Iranian defenders holding positions around the refinery and port facilities, while British aircraft and artillery pounded their positions. But by evening, the Iranians were forced into full retreat northward toward Avaz, abandoning the oil installations that were Britain's primary objective in southern Iran. General Slim's 10th Division, advancing through mountain passes toward Kermanshah, encountered the strongest Iranian resistance of the campaign when the Iranian 12th Division blocked the narrow Pai-Tak Pass on August 26th, using the mountainous terrain to negate British advantages in tanks and aircraft. For a day, Iranian forces held the pass against repeated British attacks, inflicting casualties and demonstrating that given favorable terrain and determined leadership, Iranian troops could fight effectively even against superior forces. But when Slim ordered his 9th Armored Brigade to bypass the pass entirely, taking a southern route to seize the road at Shahabad behind Iranian positions, the defenders found themselves outflanked with no choice but retreat or encirclement. On the morning of August 27th, Iranian forces abandoned the pass and withdrew across country toward Kermanshah, opening the road for Slim's forces, while their organized resistance began disintegrating into scattered units trying to fall back toward Tehran. That same day, the Soviet 53rd Army under General Sergei Trofimenko launched its offensive from Turkmenistan in the northeast, with Soviet tanks and motorized infantry advancing so rapidly that the city of Mashhad fell within hours as hopelessly outmatched Iranian defenders either surrendered or fled, leaving the road to Tehran open from yet another direction. Reza Shah, watching his army collapse on all fronts simultaneously, recognized that continued resistance was pointless and would only result in more Iranian casualties without changing the inevitable outcome. On August 27th, just 3 days after the invasion began, the Shah ordered his forces to cease resistance and accepted Allied demands, allowing British and Soviet forces to complete their occupation of Iran without further fighting. The speed of Iran's collapse demonstrated not Iranian military weakness so much as the impossibility of a developing nation with limited modern weapons resisting simultaneous invasion by two great powers possessing overwhelming superiority in tanks, aircraft, and industrial capacity. Having secured military control of Iran through rapid conquest, the Allies set about transforming the country to serve their strategic needs. On September 16, 1941, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who would rule as a puppet while Allied forces controlled Iranian territory and commandeered the Trans-Iranian Railway to begin moving massive quantities of military supplies northward to the Soviet Union. British forces occupied southern Iran, including the oil fields. Soviet forces controlled the north, and a small American contingent arrived later to help manage the supply operation that transformed Iran into what would become known as the Persian Corridor. Over the next 4 years, Iran served as a crucial conduit for Allied military aid to the Soviet Union, with approximately 3,500 aircraft and 150,000 vehicles of all kinds passing through Iranian territory on their way north, supplementing the Arctic convoys and providing the Red Army with trucks, tanks, aircraft, and other equipment that played an instrumental role in Soviet ability to resist German offensives in 1942 and 1943, before launching the massive counteroffensives that would eventually drive German forces back to Berlin. Winston Churchill, visiting Tehran in November 1943 for a conference with Roosevelt and Stalin, described Iran in glowing terms as the bridge to victory, recognizing that without the supply route through Iran, the Soviet Union might have collapsed and allowed Germany to win the war. But this victory came at catastrophic cost to Iran, which was forced to accept foreign military occupation and economic exploitation for the good of Allied war aims, while receiving nothing in return except promises of eventual independence. The Allied seizure of the Trans-Iranian Railway and most truck transport in the country, combined with an influx of tens of thousands of British, Soviet, and later American military personnel who consumed Iranian food supplies, strained Iran's economy to breaking point. Inflation soon reached 450% as the Allied occupation disrupted normal economic activity, while demand for food and goods skyrocketed, pricing basic necessities beyond the reach of ordinary Iranians. In 1943, widespread famine broke out across Iran as Allied demands for transport to move military supplies north prevented movement of food from agricultural regions to cities, while Allied personnel consumed available supplies, and inflation made food unaffordable even when available. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Iranians died from starvation and diseases related to malnutrition, perishing so that Allied trucks and trains could carry weapons and ammunition to Soviet forces fighting hundreds of miles away. The famine, combined with the humiliation of foreign occupation and the arbitrariness with which the Allies had invaded a neutral country, created deep bitterness among Iranians who saw their neutrality violated and their people sacrificed for a war that was not their own. The invasion and occupation of Iran demonstrated how quickly international law and respect for neutrality vanished when great powers faced existential threats, as Britain and the Soviet Union simply took what they needed from a weaker country, regardless of Iran's declared neutrality or its legitimate desire to remain outside the war. The operation succeeded militarily because Iran could not resist two great powers attacking simultaneously, and succeeded strategically because the Trans-Iranian Railway did indeed become a vital supply route that helped sustain Soviet resistance and eventual victory over Germany. For Iran, the occupation left scars that shaped politics for decades, creating deep suspicion of outside powers and resentment over how easily Britain and Russia had invaded and controlled Iranian territory. When Allied forces finally withdrew in 1946, leaving behind a country economically devastated and politically unstable, the bitterness created during the occupation helped fuel nationalist movements, including Mohammad Mossadegh's campaign in the early 1950s to nationalize Iranian oil and end British control, leading to the 1953 coup that would poison Iranian-Western relations further. The occupation also contributed to revolutionary sentiment that would eventually topple the Shah in 1979, as many Iranians remembered how his father had been installed and maintained by foreign powers who cared nothing for Iranian sovereignty. The forgotten war of 1941, overshadowed by the massive battles in Europe and the Pacific that would follow, nevertheless changed history by keeping the Soviet Union in the war at a moment when German victory seemed possible, demonstrating that control of supply routes and resources often mattered more than battlefield victories. Iran's sacrifice, involuntary and uncompensated, helped save the Allied cause, while condemning hundreds of thousands of Iranians to death from famine and economic collapse, a cost that Allied leaders considered acceptable for strategic advantage, but that Iranians would never forget or forgive. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.